All right, so this lesson here is, I just like to call it kind of the intro. Like I said, a little baseline knowledge for all these things. So the first thing we're going to talk about is...
What would you call it? Intro to what? Intro to all different? Or?
Intro to being a private pilot.
Oh, okay.
Yes. And we'll just, like I said, we'll cover a lot of the basics for a lot of these different things, but we'll work our way down the line here. So the first thing we're going to talk about is fitness for flight. Now, fitness for flight, this is going to have to do with you as a pilot. It's going to be, there's a checklist that you can follow. Do you take that? Okay. There's a checklist that you can follow each time you go fly to make sure that you yourself are capable of performing that flight that day. So the checklist is called the I'm Safe. You're familiar with that, correct?
Yep, I remember the acronym, I just don't remember what it was.
Okay, perfect. So we got I. Is illness 2 L's?
Yes.
Yes. Illness. So that could be any sort of flu, cold, anything like that. I don't know if you've ever flown before with a just runny, stuffy nose. When you get up in the higher altitudes, it kind of cause problems. Make sure you're aware of that. If you think it's going to be, if you're in the middle of a flight and it's not working out for you, just end the flight. Next one, M. Medication. Now, with medication, there is a list that the FAA provides. We've talked about it before, that goes along with all the medications that you can take. Some of them have, like, for example, Benadryl. I don't remember the exact time for it, but if you take a Benadryl the night before, it's just like alcohol. There's a certain time that you have to wait for flying, but there's a whole list. We can go over that later. So M, that's medication. Now, S. Now, pun intended, I like to stress this one a lot because flying while you're stressed out can cause errors in judgment. It can cause you to make the wrong decision, and stress can come from anything exterior, whether that's, get-there-itis, work stuff, family stuff, whatever it may be. So I would highly recommend when you're in that situation and you're just not having a good day, haven't taken a lot of wins that day, maybe reconsider that flight. Next one, I kind of already covered it. Alcohol. Now, according to the FAA, what we call it is 8 hours bottom throttle. Also, the legal limit, just for your information, is a .04 BAC.
Which is so funny because, so you could...
Make sure this is recording still. Okay, go ahead.
You could, 8 hours bottle of throttle, but you could drink a beer
And be under a .04.
.04. So, but that's probably just.
I think it's honestly, if you go out drinking with buddies the night before and the next morning you still have some alcohol in your system. It's been 8 hours, but and actually at K-State it was 12.
Oh.
But obviously, that's not an issue for you at all. Now the F, there's a bunch of different, these last two, the F and E, there's a bunch of different ones you can use, but I'll take you through the ones that I like to use. Now, make sure I spell that right. Fatigue and food. Those are the two that I like to assign to the F here. Fatigue, again, kind of goes with, these all tie together.
Right.
That's the biggest thing. So fatigue could come from illness, any medication, stress, alcohol. So all those kind of tie together. Same with food. If you recommend eating a good breakfast, especially if you have a morning flight, make sure you haven't gone all day without eating, because like I said, that can cause all these other things to come to light. And the last one, and again, it kind of ties into stress a little bit. I kind of already covered it, but emotions, external pressures, whatever you want to call that. But that ties into stress mainly. So now, like I said, there's a bunch of different ways you can do this. Some people, instead of emotions, they put eating instead of food. But like I said, you can go through that, and you can even create your own checklist that works for you. Maybe you don't want to follow this one, but just make sure you as a pilot are fit for flight. Cool?
Yes, sir. sir.
Any questions?
Nope.
Perfect. Alright. Now, which I'm sure you probably already covered a little bit, what do you need to be a pilot? That's what we're going to cover. So the first thing is a third class medical, which you're already in the process of getting. Now, a lot of these things you've already surpassed. The next one is at least 17 years old. So 17 years old, obviously you're a few years past that. 17 to get your full private pilot's license. At 16, you can get your student pilot certificate and fly solo. And any time before that, you can log hours. Doesn't matter. Carter could log hours at 12 now if you wanted to. Next thing, which again, you've already done, is marker sets.
Yeah, some of them might be.
I spelled that wrong, that's okay. So you've already passed your knowledge test. That's the next qualification. Next one, you gotta complete all the required flight training. Obviously you're Part 61, so that's gonna be 40 total hours with all the subcategories underneath that, whether that's nighttime, solo cross country, dual time, all those things. And then the last one, obviously, pass your oral and your practical. So this right here is the layout of all the things you're gonna have to do. Now, obviously, each one of these things have different subcategories that you can talk about, but when you ask yourself, what do I need to be a pilot? This is good here. You got all that written down?
I did.
Any questions?
Nope.
Perfect. We'll keep on rolling then. All right. I kind of set this up in question format. So the next question you could ask is, what do I need to carry in the plane when I'm flying? Now, when you're with Matt, obviously right now you don't even have a medical or any certifications yet, so that doesn't apply during dual flight training. But, let's see how I want to write this. This next question is, what do I need to carry in the plane? So this here is going to cover, there's only 3 things that we're going to cover that you have to carry in your plane, actually 4. But first thing is obviously your pilot certificate. Once you have it, pilot certificate. I might switch to blue after this. You need a valid US photo ID, which you have, and that can be driver's license, passport, just has to be government issued. And then obviously your current medical. And then, which I forgot to put this on my notes. Let me switch markers. But you also need your logbook. You're aware that when you go on your first solo, you have endorsements. When you go on your first solo cross country, you have endorsements. So let's say you went to Kansas City or something on your first solo cross country, you get ramp checked, which doesn't happen very often, but it does. You have to be able to show them all these things. Cool?
Mm-hmm.
Perfect. All right. The next one you are familiar with, but for this video teaching purposes, I'll still go through it. So what does the airplane need to fly? Do you remember what acronym we use for that?
Yep, the ARROW.
ARROW. Awesome.
Airworthiness Certificate.
Perfect.
Well, I'm gonna get it right here.
No, you're good.
Air.
Okay, I'm switching to blue.
Yeah, just find one that works.
Yeah.
So you're using $2.
If you don't know, you might know what the other R is, but
Right.
yeah, if you want to list them off, you already know it.
So it's the Airworthiness Certificate,
Airworthiness.
registration.
Perfect.
Sorry, I'm writing too.
No, you're good. Now, here's a quick question too that I was gonna cover on the registration. Do you know how long the registration lasts for an
Oh,
airplane?
yes, we went over this. The registration is good for 2 years, 5 years, 3 years. Gosh,
You're good. Okay, you know what the second R is?
Radio certificate or radio, whatever the
Radio license.
radio license.
Yep.
That's it, only for flying overseas though.
Perfect. So, yeah, you're good there. I don't even bother writing that down. O,
And O is the operating handbook or operator's manual, however, whatever it says.
technically, it's the operating limitations. Now, most
Okay.
people would think that's just the POH or the operator's manual, but it could also be any sort of placards that are posted in there. Like, for example, in our K-State airplanes, we have a placard up that says, this aircraft is certified for spins, this aircraft is certified for da-da-da-da. Has the maneuvering speeds, we even have one that we put in there ourselves for the max RPM that we cruise
When
at.
you Google that, some of them
Yeah.
say operating handbook, some of them say owner's registration, some of them say owner, there's just, but anyway,
Yeah. And then the last one,
weight and balance.
weight and balance, perfect. Now, when it comes to weight and balance in the airplane, if I remember correctly, you know how at K-State we did these little weight and balance sheets every time that we figured? That's not an official weight and balance document. You need to have an official weight, like the picture I sent, or Matt sent us with the weight and balance on it. That's what you have to have, because you have to have an official signed document that says this is the basic empty weight of the aircraft, so on and so forth. So that's weight and balance. So that's our aero checklist. Again, that's what the airplane needs to fly. Now, at a later date, we're going to go into actual aircraft equipment. That's your A Tomato Flames acronym. And we'll go into that at a later date. But as far as that, do you have any questions? Perfect. We'll keep on going. I'm going to start getting into systems here shortly. Okay, actually, next we're going to talk about flight controls. Alright, so flight controls, obviously, like their name, they control the aspects of flight. Now there's two different types of flight controls. You have your primary and your secondary. Now, the way I like to explain primary flight controls is it's a flight control that directly controls the aircraft. So knowing what you know now, what do you think those things would be?
So it'd be your elevator.
Yep.
Ailerons, rudder.
That's it. Even spell VIL. So, like I said before, these things directly control the flight of the aircraft. So when you push that rudder pedal left, that plane goes left. You roll the ailerons right, it goes right. Now, the secondary flight controls, which I'm sure you were probably trying to get into before, what do you think those things would be? There's only two that I have on my list that I'm aware of, that we have on our Cessna. The way I like to think it is, they're there.
throttle?
Nope.
No, throttle.
They're there to help. They're flight
Trim?
controls. Good, that's one.
Trim and.
What else helps you fly and helps you land?
Trim and.
What do you almost always use when you land?
Oh, flaps.
Yep.
Jeez.
Yep, so the way I like to think about this, again, kind of reiterating what I said before, these things you need to fly. These things are there to help. So yeah, you could do a no flap landing without any trim control, anything like that. Now, if your trim goes crazy like the 737 MAX 8, then it's a different story. But again, these are there to help. These directly control the flight of the aircraft. And then at a later time, we'll get into the physics of how all that stuff works. The next thing I'm gonna get into is the principles of flight. Again, this is just a very surface level, there's a lot of physics behind it, but we'll just kind of get you familiar with all of that, and then we'll go from there. Did you have any other questions on flight controls? You said no?
No.
Okay. Actually,
Do you practice no flap landings in private?
I only did a couple times, but that's probably up to the instructor. But one thing before you start writing more notes, our flight control system, it's just a series of cables and pulleys. Now obviously that's for our primary flight controls. And also you have your trim tab too that does that. Now our flaps are obviously electrically operated, but we'll get into the electrical system.
And a lot of them are manual.
Mm-hmm. Well, some of them have them like
Grandpa's plane,
down,
yeah,
pull them and
yeah.
But yep, so it's just a series of cables and pulleys. I know when we went to Bombardier that one time, they talked about the whole fly-by-wire stuff, and now everything's computerized and it's not as difficult to fly. But anyway, let's go into the principles of flight. Can you see that okay?
Yep.
Okay, I'll make sure.
Wonder if that, I didn't even think about the glare off of those windows screwing up your video.
Oh, I don't think so. I want to make sure it's still recording. Do you know if that plane has the long range tanks on it?
Oh.
I have to ask him. That's the thing that was hard, is we never got to meet to talk about some of these things, but I have it all kind of. Okay, cool. Principles of flight. So I'm sure you're familiar. You've probably heard of it before. We've got lift, we've got weight, we've got drag, we've got thrust. So first one we're going to talk about is lift. Now I'm going to do my best to draw. I'm just going to draw an aircraft here. I know that's kind of a top view, but you'll get the idea. So just imagine that this plane is actually, you're looking at it from the side. So lift is the force that acts up on an airplane, allowing it to fly. Simple as that. Like I said, at a later date, we'll go into all the physics of it. Weight is the force that acts down. Now, one thing I used to confuse was weight with gravity. They're two different things. Gravity is obviously a constant thing that acts upon everything in the same way with the same force. The weight is what changes. So every time you fly, it might be a little different. Your weight, depending on how many people you got, fuel, equipment, anything like that. Now, the next thing we got is, so I'm gonna write these down. Lift, weight. Next thing we've got is thrust. And drag. We got thrust and drag. So thrust is the pulling motion that is obviously provided by the power plant. That's really all you need to know about that right now. Drag is, it's a disruption of airflow is what happens, and it causes anything that's on the aircraft that might cause a disruption of airflow. Now, one thing that's important about drag, and I would, if you want to write this down, it's kind of getting a little technical, you can, but we have what's called induced and parasite drag. Okay, have you talked about these at all? Are you kind of
Matt and I haven't, but in ground they covered it briefly.
So the way I like to kind of explain it is induced drag is drag that you are yourself inducing. So let's say you've done a lot of pattern work recently. Let's say you're on downwind, you're past your beam, wherever your touchdown point is, and you pull power. What is that nose going to do?
Drop.
Right, and to keep that nose up, you're going to have to add back pressure. That is induced drag, because your angle of attack, when it was straight and level, is now a little bit higher to maintain that altitude. Your angle of attack's higher. So that is an example of induced drag. So with induced drag, induced drag decreases with higher airspeeds, because if you're at a slower airspeed, you have to hold that nose higher to hold altitude, correct?
Yeah.
Make sense?
Yeah.
Perfect. Now, parasite drag is something that you can only control with speed. Parasite drag is anything caused by, the wheels, the landing gear, anything that air is just running into. That's causing drag. That is what's called parasite drag, because you cannot control that with any flight control. Now, the thing not to get confused between these two is parasite drag actually worsens when you get faster, because that air is hitting those surfaces harder, causing more drag. And then one thing I will mention, just to kind of get you acclimated with that, one thing you're going to hear about, have you ever heard of lift drag ratio? Mm-hmm. So when they figure out their best glide speed, they find out what their best lift drag ratio is, which means you have the most amount of lift with the least amount of drag. So that's all we're gonna cover with that right now. I'm gonna make sure I didn't miss anything. But we'll go into kind of the biggest thing with this stuff too is talking about the camber of the wing and how air flows over it. But we'll cover that at a later time. So again, wait. And actually, I'm glad I caught that. One thing I forgot to mention, when you were in straight and level flight, all four of these things act in equilibrium. And actually, one thing I learned in CFI ground this year was, so you know how, say you're in an F-16 and you're flying, you take off, you're flying level and they do their unrestricted climb. So when your vertical speed is increasing, thrust is greater, or lift is greater than weight, okay? But when you settle into a steady state climb, let's say you're climbing at 500 feet per minute and that thing is not, your VSI is not moving, again, all these things are back to equilibrium. And the opposite is true for any sort of flight control that you do. When everything is stable, all these things are acting together. Same thing, when you shove that nose over, in the beginning, when your vertical speed is decreasing into the negatives, your weight, your lift. So, that's all I'm gonna cover with that right now. Again, there's a lot more physics with it. Is there anything that wasn't making sense at all? Are you clear on the difference between induced and parasite drag? Okay. Is there anything, literally anything? This is for both of us, so. Probably the next time we'll go over the camber of the wing and Newton's laws and all that stuff, which I'm sure you're super excited about, but that's all we're gonna cover for now. Spike glue doesn't erase very well. Perfect. All right, we're gonna get into just the basics of the fuel system. So, are you aware at all of how fuel is fed in an airplane like this? How it gets from the wings to the engine?
Gravity fed out of the wing.
Perfect.
On a high wing airplane.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. I've never actually flown a low wing, so I don't even know how that would work for low wings. But
I have, but it's been a very, very long time ago.
what'd you fly?
Well, I rode with Grandpa Tom when he flew a Piper.
Oh, that's right.
Cherokee.
Perfect. So now you're already good there. For our aircraft, the standard tanks are 38 gallons. And then long range tanks are 48 gallons. Now, one thing I'm gonna do with the fuel system, which this is actually pretty easy for me to teach you because you're familiar with how cars work, obviously, and how carburetors work, and correct?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I'm just gonna kind of show you real quick the schematic. You don't have to really remember any of this right now, but so this is the layout of how our fuel system works. We obviously have our fuel tanks in the wings. It's gravity fed down to our fuel selector valve, which you're familiar with. You always have it on both unless circumstances dictate otherwise. Goes to here. Here's your engine primer, which does that plane has a primer, does it? Yep, perfect. All right, so the fuel flows down in through here, and then eventually it goes to the carburetor, which you're familiar with, just regulates your fuel air mixture. Goes to the carburetor and then to the engine. It's as simple as that. So, like I said, with fuel selector, if you got it on left or right, it's gonna block one of these tanks. And obviously primer just allows fuel to come in to prime the engine. I just kind of wanted to show you that, just so you kind of had a picture in your head of how that worked. And it's, like I said, it's a carbureted engine, so you have to use carb heat. All right, that's really all I had for that right now. Is there any questions you had on it? Okay, perfect. And again, at a later date, we'll go into the science of, I'm sure you're probably familiar with the science of a carburetor, but all right, electrical system. This is so much better than holding a whiteboard and trying to teach.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we just need to get them bigger. Those,
There we go, that'll work.
those markers have been around since 2008 when we built this building.
All right, so,
So I had to bring yours in.
I don't know, well, they're like smaller tip, so they're very thin, but, so, biggest thing is, it's a 14-volt direct current system. Now, our electrical system, kind of like I mentioned before when it came to flight controls, anything that can be used without the master on is not run by electrical systems. So once you turn that master on, you've got your displays, you've got lights, navigation, all those things like that. So if the master's not on and you can still use it, it's not electrically run. Now, just like a car, it has a engine driven alternator. And just like a car, when that engine starts running, that alternator belt starts spinning, charges the battery. And the battery in this plane is a 12-volt battery. So really, that alternator is the biggest thing. And in some POHs, it gives the amperage of the alternator, but this one did not. This is a 1970-something airplane, so it's not quite as in detail as our newer ones, but that's really all I had for that. Just know that if you can't use it when the master's off, then it's run electrically. It flaps too, like I said before. Then once you start that engine, that battery starts running. I'm sure you're familiar with the voltage meter in the airplane that makes sure it shows everything's charging. And if it's not, that'll be something we'll cover later. But really the basics of that with electrical problems not charging is just to shut down all the non-essential equipment and land, obviously. But your engine will still run without that. But do you have any questions on that? Okay, perfect. All right, let's talk about the vacuum system. Are you familiar at all with how a vacuum system works?
A little bit.
So you know that in a normal steam gauge airplane, you have gyroscopically controlled instruments. That's your attitude indicator and your heading indicator. Now, again, this is difficult because I haven't talked to Matt about it, but since he has the G5s in there now, and they're an electronic display, I don't know if they got rid of the vacuum system. Are you aware of that at all?
That I don't know.
Okay. Well, we'll cover that at a later date. I'll talk to him about that. But as far as you need to know, as far as the vacuum system, all it does is it sucks in air, it spins those gyros. That's it. And it allows the attitude indicator and the heading indicator to work. So yeah, just sucks air to spin gyros and then attitude and heading indicators. So that's really all I had there. I mean, you've already got it written down, so there's no reason for me to write it down. But all right, pitot-static system, which you're already kind of familiar with. All right, first thing we're going to talk about is the pitot tube. You've obviously done pre-flight, so you know what the pitot tube is, correct? Perfect. All that does is it measures ram air going into that pitot tube that gives us our airspeed. So the pitot tube is responsible for our airspeed indicator. Cool?
Yeah.
So airspeed indicator. Okay, perfect. Now the static port, the way I like to think about this, you used to ride motorcycles. So imagine you're riding a motorcycle, the wind's blowing in your face and you open your mouth. The air going in your mouth is the pitot tube, the ram air. The air going beside your ears that you hear, that's your static port. It's static air that it's measuring, okay? Now your static port is responsible for your VSI, vertical speed indicator, and your altimeter. Now, all these things work together to work correctly. And at a later time, we'll go into, for example, what happens if your pitot tube gets clogged. That was a question I had on one of my projects.
Actually, I think those questions are all in the knowledge exam.
Yeah, I'm sure you've
Potential
probably seen.
questions,
Yeah, but there's a schematic that just has it all
Yep.
laid out that I like to look at,
Yep.
and it helps a lot.
Yep, it's in the book.
So just making sure these things are always clear. I don't know, Matt might throw you a curveball one day, and before you get out there, he puts a piece of tape over it, or whatever. So make sure you're always watching for that, because that's his job, is to evaluate you on everything, not just taking off and landing again. It's everything, pre-flight, post-flight, in-flight stuff. That is his job, to evaluate you before he signs that endorsement, because when he puts that name on there, you're his responsibility, and he is vouching for you. It's literally the same thing as a recommendation. But that's all I'm going to go into with that. Make sure that was all I had. Do you have any questions on that, on these things?
Nope.
Okay, did that analogy make sense to you? Okay, perfect. I forgot who told me that. I really liked it. Maybe it was Jim. All right. I'm not even gonna bother writing this down because you can just write it down right now. Hydraulic system, all you need to worry about, brakes. When you inspect the wheels and the tires, you're always checking for hydraulic fluid. I think it's got like a bluish color to it, which is probably kind of hard to tell on concrete, but always inspect around the tires, make sure you don't have any hydraulic fluid leaking, because that will affect your brakes. The next thing, which you and I have talked about a lot, again, I'm not even gonna bother writing down, is just checklist usage. I don't care how many hours you have. You've got 4 hours, so 4-point-some hours now. Once you get to however many hours, use your checklist. Obviously, to a point where it's still safe. You don't want to let your checklist distract you either, but you need to make sure they're getting done in each phase of flight. Pre-flight, before takeoff, climb, cruise, before landing, after landing. Obviously, if you're in a sticky situation with tower, that's why we talk about our BC GUMS checklist, or that's what they said at K-State. I just use GUMS. Are you familiar with the GUMS checklist?
Gas undercarriage, mixture, prop, and seatbelt.
That is something, the reason they have you remember that in your head is because you fly up to Salina and there's 72 K-State airplanes in the pattern. You're running around talking to tower. You can just real quick gas undercarriage mixture. You don't have to look at a checklist.
Right.
So.
So Matt and I actually talked about GUMS, and I always had in my head as gas undercarriage mixture, propeller, and seat belts, but there was like 3 things that the S could cover, like seat belts. You remember?
Oh, yeah, I know what you're talking about.
Maybe it's seat belt, shoulder harnesses, and
seat tracks.
seat
Make
tracks.
sure your seat tracks
tracks.
is in there.
Oh, okay, maybe that's what it was.
Yeah. That's a good point. I'm glad you brought that up. But really, I mean, when I
He
say
mentioned it, but I was flying at the time and I missed part of what.
Yeah. This is going to be a little bit more, like I said, we're covering a little more areas than he really wanted me to, but I figured this is going to help you save money, and that way all you guys have to do is reiterate stuff. So we're just going to go over just some real basic weather stuff. Should only take a few minutes.
You're past your 20 minutes, just so you know.
Yeah, I know. You're getting a free ground lesson, so hush. All right.
Almost lunchtime.
Yeah, I know. I was going to say, what are you doing for lunch? So we're going to get something. Anyway. So weather basics, I'm sure you're familiar with. WX is just short for weather. Now, first thing we're going to talk about, and you and I kind of talked about it already when we came to ForeFlight, is a METAR. Now, METAR, when you see it, is usually all in caps, so you think it's an acronym, but it's actually just a code word that just means Aviation Routine Weather Report. So if you want to write that down, you can. I don't think you'll ever really be asked that, but so a METAR is updated every single hour, usually between 55 and 59 minutes past the hour, so it's ready to go for the next one. So if you're taking off at 4:45 or 4:50 in the afternoon, you may, and the winds are 360 at 5, that may be different. That's when you're gonna have to look at your wind socks, anything like that. But main thing to know is every hour, now if there's a thunderstorm that comes in, tornado, any sort of crazy weather that happens, they can issue a special METAR, and you'll see it when you see the coded METARs, it'll say SPECI at the very beginning of everything. So just look for that. But obviously if you see a METAR updated in the middle of the hour, you know it's probably a special METAR. Let's go TAFs. Now TAF is just a terminal aerodrome forecast. I believe it covers, I think it's a 5-mile radius of the specified airport. Don't quote me on that though, I'd have to recheck that, but it just came into my head.
Terminal aerodrome?
Aerodrome, yeah, it's another word for airport. So terminal airport forecast, if you want to call it that. You'd have to look up the spelling on that, but yeah, it's the same thing as like, there's the airport and then the aerodrome is basically just the areas kind of surrounding it, if that makes sense. But TAFs are updated 6 hours. And they're updated 4 times a day, so they cover a 24-hour forecast period. And some areas may have up to 30 hours, but it just kind of depends. You may get lucky sometimes. Now, and again, I've already talked to you about MOS. Now, there's not a whole lot of information that it can offer that's probably reliable. Like I said, it's a model output statistics or something like that. And it even said, do not use this for weather forecasting, use an official National Weather Service provider. But this can just, you know, the MOS can go out. I've seen the MOS go out 3 or 4 days ahead of time. So this can be a good idea. You got a flight coming up, maybe you can just kind of get an idea. You know, if you see a whole 2 days where it's just storming, you know, hey, maybe that's probably not going to work out. So we covered TAFs. You're good. So every 6 hours for a 24-hour period. And then some F30 and then the MOS. So we just covered that. And the last thing we're going to talk about with this, and then we only have one more thing to cover, which is super easy, is just the AWOS. Now, are you familiar with what that stands for?
Automated Weather Observation Service?
I believe it's service.
System, service?
Service or system. But you've obviously used that a lot. All it really is it's a METAR that's read out loud on frequency or on a phone call. It updates every hour the same, gives you the crucial information. So that's really all you need to know about that. Now, this next one is probably going to resonate a little bit with your law enforcement
So
background.
what's the difference between an AWOS and an ASOS?
That I don't know, but I'm gonna have to find out because I think, actually, if I know this right, and I'd have to ask Matt, or I can research it when we're done, but I've noticed, like, let me go to Salinas Airport here
So
on
this
maps.
says Automated Weather Observing System.
Yes.
Because Augusta is an ASOS.
Yes. So I'm wondering.
Automated, I know, I looked this up once, but it's been a while.
Let me just look it up.
Automated Station.
Yeah, you're gonna have to look it up because my computer's not connected to the internet. But I believe an ASOS is something that like the tower reads off. You know what I'm saying? The tower guy gives out.
Automated Surface Observing System.
Okay. Cool.
Okay,
So some tower and airports probably will have that.
yeah.
Most actually, not all. So yeah, you go to Salina, you've got it. And then you've got the ATIS. I believe the ATIS then is what your control tower guys are reading off when you get the frequency.
Yeah, that's the automated.
Information Bravo.
Terminal, is it automated
Terminal information.
service?
Yeah. I need to look up these acronyms. But automated terminal information service, maybe? Did I get it right? See if you can find it. But yeah.
Yep, Automated Terminal Information Service.
Sweet. Perfect. So that's like, you know, when you go up to Salina, I'm hoping maybe you and I can just fly up there sometime.
So, do you know if the AWOS and the ATIS will read the same?
The ATIS will, let's say, you know, you go to Howard Airport, Eisenhower, Salina, and they give you information Bravo.
Yes.
Those things will update every hour unless there's a major weather change. So kind of like a METAR, there's gonna be times where it may update faster than the hour, but yes, they should read very similar. I believe, I trust ATIS a little bit more than just AWAS services, again, because I know that when that tower's open and the weather's changing, the wind's changed a lot, then they're gonna update it. That AWAS is just the robot guy that's just measuring it every hour. But again, there's a lot of other things at a non-towered airport you can use to
So
check
if it updates in the middle of the hour, the ATIS, like when the tower's giving it to you, will they change the letter, like say, now you have information Juliet?
Yeah,
if they change it in the middle of the hour, will that letter change also?
Yes. Every time they update it, it will change. So
Okay.
when, for example, it always seemed to work out where Kate and I, we'd get in, start up, go do our run up, or we get the ATIS after we start up, then we'd go do our run up, and by the time we did our run up, it changed again. So we'd call up K-State 34, information Bravo, ready to taxi, and then halfway through our taxi, be like, K-State 34, advise when you have Charlie. You know, it would happen all the time. So, and sometimes they will broadcast over the tower frequency, and they'll say, attention all aircraft, information Charlie now active, now current. Yes, exactly. So the last thing we're gonna cover, super easy, like I said, it may resonate with your law enforcement training. I don't know how much they cover this stuff, but it's ADM, that's your aeronautical decision making. So the official definition of that is ADM is an ever-evolving systematic approach to the mental process used by pilots to consistently determine the best course of action in response to a set of circumstances. Now, I'm sure you probably had stuff like that in law enforcement training. They probably talked about, you know, making the best decisions in high stress situations. And so you're familiar with that. So that's something that, while can be taught, it's also learned through experience. And yes, you can read checklists all day long for emergency procedures, but if your mind's not prepared to handle that, it doesn't matter. You can't collect yourself, and sometimes there might be things that happen that don't have a checklist, and you got to figure it out. You know, it's like Jim Badgett always said. You got to be that guy. If your plane loses one wing, you can helicopter it to the ground. You know. So it's as simple as that. Now, to tie all of these things that we've talked about together, have you ever heard of the PAVE checklist?
Yes.
Okay. Now this is kind of a pre-flight check that applies for all aspects of flight, not just you as the pilot. So the first P is obviously for pilot. So you remember when we talked about our I'm safe checklist? That's what you're going to go through when you're going through this PAVE checklist. So you say, okay, PAVE, P, that's for pilot, me as a pilot. I'm going to do my I'm safe checklist. Cool? All right. Now, the next thing, like we talked about before with required documents stuff, is aircraft. Are you familiar with all the documents that your aircraft has on board? Are you familiar with all the systems? Anything that you're required? And kind of going back to pilot, you know, that not just I'm safe, but also your qualifications and your documents. Same with aircraft. Make sure you know your systems are up to date. Make sure your pre-flight's good to go. So that's all for there. The V, don't get it confused. This word doesn't start with a V, but it's for environment. So, okay, yeah, sure. So environment, that could be anything, like we covered weather. We covered weather, we covered when you get to talking about airport markings and, you know, maybe the place you're at that day is really busy and you're still a student pilot wanting to go do pattern work, maybe you ought to reconsider if you're not comfortable in an environment like that. Now the last one, like we covered before, sorry, I'm kind of losing my board here.
I'm not that blind, you don't have to write that big.
Well, I'm gonna do it anyway in case I have to teach in the classroom one day. So, external pressures. That was something we covered again in our I'm safe checklist for our P and pilot. Again, I still remember to this day when Matt and I were talking about this when I was doing my private. He said, what if, you know, your dad called or wanted you to take him somewhere in a plane and all of a sudden the weather's bad and he needs to get to this meeting or he's gonna get fired, what are you gonna do? Well, you're not gonna, yeah, get fired. So I still remember that conversation this day, but making sure there's no external pressures that are going to cause you to force a flight that's just not working for you. Again, that can be anything: marriage, kids, work, get-there-itis, girlfriend. We've all been there. Yeah, trying to impress people, which obviously you don't have anything to prove, but I know a lot of people my age fall into that category. That, what do they call that? Josh Flowers said it, like the time right after you get your private license when your ego's really high and your experience really low.
Yeah.
It's not the pilot graveyard, it's,
Yeah.
I don't remember, I have to watch that video again.
I'll think of it.
Yeah, when you think of it, let me know. But this pay checklist can be considered part of your ADM process. This is all stuff that you want to consider before you even start pre-flighting that aircraft. Now, obviously, with aircraft, you're gonna have to be in the aircraft to do that stuff. But is there any questions you had about this? Anything that wasn't clear? Anything that wasn't clear overall? Anything you wanted me to kind of re-explain? Or, like I said, Matt is gonna watch this and he'll probably have a motorcade of critiques, but that's what this is for. So, and anything I may have gotten wrong or missaid, we'll make sure we clear up, because that's something we learn in FOI, the law of primacy. So when someone learns something the wrong way the first time, it's very difficult to get them. So teach it right the first time, you're good to go. So it's very hard to break those initial habits when you're learning a new skill. So that's all I really had for today. Like I said, if there's anything that wasn't clear, I'll send that. I have to post it on YouTube because the videos are too long, but if there's anything that wasn't clear, just let me know. And like I said, he'll clear up anything too, any questions you might have. But we'll go into more of that, the physics stuff behind things too, at a later time. But like I said, just surface stuff today. Is that cool?
Yeah. Every bit of this was, we went over on the ground, and Matt and I were talking